In England, they found human skulls that someone had turned into bowls. And the most disturbing part? These weren't enemies, not victims of war, not starving people. These were their own dead, people they had just lost, lying next to the bones of deer and horses, because there was plenty of food, and yet someone had stripped those skulls of flesh, trimmed the edges, polished them from the inside, and shaped them into vessels. Researchers from the Natural History Museum in London, who spent decades studying these bones, called it the clearest known example of ritual cannibalism in world history. And that's not a metaphor. Today we'll move from the earliest traces humans left beside the dead, through graves of children that held more wealth than those of adult hunters, through the world's first funeral fire, through a cave that Neanderthals visited again and again across generations. And at the end, I'll tell you about a creature with a brain 1/3 the size of ours, whose burials are still splitting science into two irreconcilable camps. Before we talk about us, we need to talk about a creature that lived long before us, one that, until very recently, we didn't think capable of contemplating death at all. In the Rising Star Cave System in South Africa, paleoanthropologist Lee Berger's team announced the discovery of burials belonging to a creature called Homo naledi, which had hands almost like an ape's and a brain 1/3 the size of ours. The bodies lay in neatly dug pits, arranged in a curled position, and on the walls nearby, geometric engravings that, according to the researchers, were intentionally made by this creature itself. But here's the problem. Half the scientists believe this is the oldest cemetery in human history, pushing the origin of burial rituals back hundreds of thousands of years further than we thought. The other half believe there's no cemetery there at all. The engravings could have been made by natural weathering or animal claws, and the bones could have ended up in the pits without intentional burial. This debate is not settled. It's happening right now. But the fact that this debate exists at all already overturns the old picture, because until recently, the question simply didn't arise. It was assumed that a large brain was required for caring about the dead. Now, that's no longer certain. What no one disputes: around 100,000 years ago, in Kafsa Cave in Israel, people were already deliberately burying their dead, and placed beside them marine shells and red ochre, objects with no practical function in a grave, but which clearly carried meaning for those who put them there. The same material appears in burials on every continent, among every people, across tens of thousands of years, in Israel and Australia, in Russia and Spain, in Africa and North America, independently of each other, without any connection between these cultures. Red ochre, an iron-rich clay the color of blood, ground into powder and scattered over the body of the dead. But here's what's genuinely strange. Why did the same ritual appear all over the world among people who could never have communicated? People who had never seen each other, living on opposite ends of the planet, all arrived at the same thing. Take red powder and cover the dead with it. One answer researchers offer: red is the color of blood, which is the color of life itself. And by covering a dead body with it, people were symbolically trying to return what was already gone, telling death, no, this person belongs to the living. Somehow, they must remain with us. Or, they were preparing them for a journey to a place they themselves had never been. We don't know for certain, but we do know that ochre was specifically sought, carried from great distances, and applied with clear care and intention. Around 33,000 years ago in Wales, a young man was buried covered so heavily in red ochre that when he was found in the 19th century, the soil around him was saturated with red several centimeters deep, and the first researchers concluded they were looking at a woman, naming him the Red Lady of Paviland, even though he was a young man with mammoth ivory ornaments. Someone worked for a very long time to prepare him for death, and that's not just a detail, because ochre in those quantities required deliberate searching and processing. But the strangest grave of all was waiting for archaeologists not in a cave and not in Europe. It was in a frozen steppe, and it held children. 34,000 years ago in Russia, 2 children died, and what their people did for them remains one of the most astonishing facts in the entire history of human burial. The boys, approximately 10 and 12 years old, were placed in a long, narrow pit, head to head. And the more archaeologists cleared the grave, the less logical everything became. Buried with the children were more than 10,000 mammoth ivory beads, 20 bracelets, around 300 fox canines with drilled holes, 16 mammoth ivory spears, carved discs, deer antlers, and across their bodies, 2 human tibia bones belonging to an unknown person. This site is called Sungir, and it became one of the central arguments in debates about the nature of early human society. Not because the children were buried richly, but because analysis of their skeletons showed that both boys had physical abnormalities. The younger one's thigh bones were so deformed that he likely could barely walk normally, and the dental enamel of both preserved evidence of multiple severe stress episodes throughout their short lives. Nearby was the burial of a man around 40 years old, someone who could hunt, protect the camp, provide for the group, and he had roughly 3,000 beads and a few ornaments, far less than the children who could do none of those things. Each mammoth ivory bead, according to researchers' estimates, required around an hour of handwork, meaning someone spent thousands of hours of their own life dressing these children for death. And this tells us that 34,000 years ago, there existed a group of people who cared for those who could give nothing back in return, neither strength nor hunting. In the mountains of northern Iraq, in Shanidar Cave, a Neanderthal died, a creature we had long imagined as nearly animal. And when anthropologist Ralph Selecki excavated this site in the 20th century, he found around the skeleton dense clusters of pollen from mountain wildflowers. So much of it and arranged in such a way that he concluded flowers had been placed on the body. And that idea overturned science. Because if Neanderthals were burying their dead with flowers, then they were grieving. At first, researchers believed Neanderthals had laid flowers on the body of the deceased. Then it turned out the pollen was most likely carried in by bees, which burrow into cave floors and bring pollen with them. It seemed like the story was over. But that's exactly when things got stranger. In 2020, in the same cave, a new skeleton was found, lying in a clearly artificially deepened pit, filled with sediment different from the surrounding layers, with ancient plant remains in the deposits around the bones. The Cambridge University team that excavated it was careful in their conclusions. They claimed nothing beyond what the evidence showed. But here is what makes Shanidar genuinely significant. This is not one burial, but several, from different eras, in the same place, which means Neanderthals returned there again and again across generations to leave their dead, which means Shanidar was a place of memory long before humans invented the word memory. Everything we've seen so far looked like care for the dead. Flowers, ochre, beads, sacred places. Now we're going to move to a ritual that a modern person would almost certainly call monstrous. And it may turn out to be one of the most human things on this list. Around 42,000 years ago, on the shore of Lake Mungo in Australia, a young woman died. Imagine a person who tends a fire over the body of someone they just lost, all through the night, who then gathers the bones, crushes them, lights the fire again, and only then buries what remains. This is the earliest known evidence of cremation in human history, and it matters not as a technical fact, but as evidence of meaning. Because one fire wasn't enough, it had to be done again, more thoroughly, more completely. And this wasn't haste, it was intention, whose meaning we can no longer read, though we know with certainty that it was there. Now, back to the cave where we started. Gough's Cave in Somerset, England, 14,700 years ago. Inside lived a group of hunters who had plenty of food. Deer and horse bones lay throughout the cave in abundance, and who, despite that, did something with the bodies of their dead that made the first researchers who found these bones catch their breath. Muscles were removed with stone tools, with surgical precision. Lips, cheeks, and tongue were cut away. Eyes were extracted. The bones of the face and the base of the skull were carefully removed. And if archaeologists had found only the marks of butchering, they would have concluded this was ordinary cannibalism. But then they looked at the skulls. After all of that, the cranial vault was carefully trimmed and polished from the inside, and it became a vessel. 3 such skulls were found at Gough's Cave, and similar objects have been discovered in France, Spain, Germany, and Croatia, meaning this was not a local oddity, but a tradition that existed across Europe throughout that era. On the forearm bone of one of the dead, after the flesh had already been stripped from it and the bone broken open for marrow, Someone carved a zigzag pattern using the same stone tool that had removed the muscle. An engraving. After eating. On a human bone. Dr. Sylvia Bello of the Natural History Museum in London, who studied these bones using three-dimensional microscopy, concluded that all of this was not starvation and not cruelty, but ritual. Complex, conscious, embedded in a culture. Because the sequence of actions performed on the bodies was too systematic and too specific to be accidental. What exactly it meant to those who did it, we don't know. Perhaps consuming the dead was a way of keeping them inside the living. Perhaps the skull was used for drinking during a ritual that helped with letting go. Perhaps this was the language in which they spoke to death, just a different language than the one we're used to. Look at all of this together. 100,000 years ago, bodies with ochre and shells in Israeli caves. 70,000, a place returned to across generations. 42,000, the first fire for the dead in Australia. 34,000, children with 10,000 beads in the Russian steppe. 14,700, skulls turned into vessels on the territory of modern Britain. This is not one story and not one tradition. It is hundreds of thousands of years of different answers to a single question that has no one correct solution. What do you do with someone who was just a person and has stopped being one? This is a question each of us will eventually have to face. We tend to think that caring for the dead came with civilization, with cities, with religion, with writing, but it appeared before all of that, before agriculture, before metal, before we learned to grow wheat, and it existed in forms so different from each other that none of them is right or wrong when viewed from a distance of hundreds of thousands of years. Skull vessels and thousands of bone beads are two ends of the same question that humanity has been asking since the very beginning. What remains after a person? What are we supposed to do with that? And what does it say about who we are? No other animal on this planet creates beads from bone and carries a body to a special place that we'll remember. And that very inability to simply walk away and leave the dead where they fell is what made us into what we became. Here's a question with no right answer. If you could choose a ritual from those that have existed throughout human history, which would you choose? Sky burial, where the body is given to birds, fire, or something else entirely? Write in the comments and subscribe.